Right. Hello, Ali.
Hi there.
Like I said, you're the first government person to have stepped on the stage at ATS London, so no pressure.
Privilege, thank you.
I thought perhaps we could start with you just maybe sharing with us a little bit of your background personally, and also what your role at the ICO specifically is focusing on.
Sure, so I'm actually quite a new starter to the ICO. I've been in the Information Commissioner's Office for about 6 months. And actually, I come from an industry prior to that, which is sort of adjacent to this community. So I used to work for a large media organization in various technology roles. My background is actually as an engineer. I then moved into many strategy and policy roles, focusing on emerging technology. My pet sort of subject is around machine learning. But my move into the ICO was really prompted by a growth in the Information Commissioner's Office, really focused on how do we start to bring more expertise in technology and innovation into the ICO, thinking about how do we, alongside the enforcement powers that the Information Commissioner has, also try and stimulate innovation. So actually, the reason I couldn't join the conversations early this morning and missed out on Martin's talk and only caught half of the last one is actually we are hosting our own event across London and Euston, where we've brought together world-leading experts on anonymization and privacy-enhancing technologies, and really thinking about how do we start to bring some of those capabilities in. But it was that sort of opportunity that brought me into the ICO, and also really recognizing that if you're interested in the role of emerging technology, automation, and personal data, then the Information Commissioner's Office is the place to be, because so many of the conversations that are happening in society are really coalescing around what will we do to try and drive our businesses, drive our online experiences, but at the same time respond to some of the social issues that we're seeing also happening alongside that.
That sounds like a really interesting event, so let's make sure it doesn't clash with ATS London next time, so that we can maybe get some of the people in the room here engaged and involved in that, and I'll ask you a bit more about the ICO's plans for that in a little bit. And just to clarify, I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but in case anybody doesn't, the ICO is the DPA for the UK. That's right, so the Data Protection Authority, Information Rights Regulator. You'll know us mostly because we regulate GDPR, but also legislation and regulations such as PECA, Freedom of Information Act. There's a whole range of regulatory frameworks that the Information Commissioner oversees, but GDPR being the primary one, and PECA. But also because the ICO is the authority that responded to and investigated Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, most recently BA and Marriott data breaches. So anywhere that personal information is being utilized across any sector, so we're a horizontal regulator, our job is to make sure that those regulations are being applied, and if there are harms or issues that affect citizens, all of you in your personal capacities, then it's our job to respond to that, to give you the rights and opportunities to leverage your rights. Okay, cool. So let's dive into some of the detail behind your most recently published AdTech update report. Can you tell us a bit about why you've published this report and what specifically you're looking at within that report in terms of your areas of concern within the AdTech industry? Sure. So as I was saying, one of the reasons that I was brought in was to really start to think about what's the broader technology landscape, what's actually happening out there. And prior to me joining, the Information Commissioner's Office did have a technology strategy out there that outlined a number of different areas to focus on, AI being one of those, cybersecurity being another, but also what it means to be surveilled online, for tracking to happen online, for cross-device information to be shared, how is that going to affect individuals? And then there's another one that we've sort of added since then, which is how do we proactively start to shape the environment to make it easier for businesses and individuals to operate online, hence the event that we're curating today. But of those strategic priorities, when we came in, we started to look and research into how personal information is utilized in your industry. Alongside that, we did receive some complaints and some concerns from industry and members of society that helped us build a picture. And as we looked into this, we did a number of things. We invited feedback from many of you. We held a fact-finding forum. In fact, on my second day joining the ICO, we had 120 people that represented publishers, advertisers, ad exchanges, DSPs, SSPs in the room to have a conversation about, okay, lay out for us the sorts of issues that you're facing. And that engagement resulted in us concluding a couple of things. One is that there, I think, is a misunderstanding around the approach to data protection that needs to be taken in the industry. And there are a couple of key areas of concern. One is around the need for transparency and consent. And then the second one is around how data gets shared throughout the ecosystem, your supply chains, your value chains. So the relationships that you have with each other,
the security, the integrity that is needed around how do you make sure that as individuals' information or a segment's information, if it's being shared, is done so with the right governance controls and technical controls. And we felt that the controls were not robust enough.
Okay, yeah, and so, I mean, the report goes into quite a bit of detail about your view on the controls that are in place, but it also talks quite extensively about the importance of PECA as a regulation and how it interacts with GDPR. Now, in this industry, we talk a lot about GDPR, and certainly we've been pretty obsessed over it in the last over the last 12 months or so. But PECA is a lot less spoken about. So perhaps you could share with us sort of your understanding of the difference perhaps between summary version, I guess, between PECA and GDPR, and where the AdTech industry perhaps is deviating from what you perceive to be the letter of the law under PECA, which is the Privacy Electronic Communications Regulation, and that sort of predates GDPR, right?
So actually, just before I dive into that, how many people, just show of hands, have read the report, just so I understand? Okay, cool. All right, so maybe half of the room, maybe slightly more, have read the room. And actually, as an engineer coming in, somebody who I felt when I was coming into the ICO that I understood GDPR and some of the regulations, actually I was schooled, right? So my team and the wider organisation, the one thing that ICO really does have is lots of specialists who focus on the legal and policy implications and really analyse these regulations. And one of the things that I was given a deep dive on was how the two regulations, PECA and GDPR, interact. And so if you are, especially for direct marketing or AdTech or marketing purposes, if you're placing cookies or using other similar technologies to try and understand who the user is that might be interacting with a website or an app, you first and foremost are subject to PECA. And a provision in PECA which says that if you are gathering information, you must obtain consent. So PECA takes precedent in that situation. GDPR then applies secondary. So this is around specialized laws, lex specialis versus lex generalis. And so the provisions in GDPR only kick in after you have complied with those provisions in PECA which say for direct marketing organizations, especially most of the organizations in this room, it is incumbent upon you to first and foremost adhere to PECA, and under PECA it is incumbent of you to try and gather consent to try and enable your processing of information, personal information.
And thereby is the sort of key difference. What you mean is that direct consent has to be obtained in that environment, and legitimate interest can't be relied upon in that context.
So when we were looking at what's the latest developments in the AdTech ecosystem and across your whole supply chains, the team spent a lot of time really trying to understand, are there circumstances under which you can achieve some exemptions, right? So under PECA, can you achieve some exemptions so that you don't have to gather consent? And our reading of the situation is that for all practical intents and purposes, it's not possible. We've spent a lot of time really trying to make sure that that is something that's a robust opinion. We would not put it in our report if we did not think it was. And in many ways, it helped to narrow our focus when we're looking at the range of issues that we saw in the AdTech ecosystem into these two areas that I mentioned before. So we've done a lot of thinking around why that is the case, and a lot of that is explained in the report. But of course, if one of the organizations in the room today is using legitimate interest and you think, actually, no, the ICO, you've got it wrong, please do come forward and have a conversation with us, because what we haven't seen so far in our engagements is anyone who's willing to say, well, we're using legitimate interest, here's the basis on which we're doing that, and be willing to have a conversation with us which says, okay, well, why is the ICO's opinion incorrect on this? And what that tells me two things. One is maybe there's a degree of nervousness in engaging with us, and I can understand that. And I think it's worth emphasizing that our aim at this moment in time is not to penalize you for having a conversation with us. Absolutely not. The other side of that is that actually when you really look at this, and if you have taken advice from your general counsels or your data protection officer, maybe when you've reviewed it, you've realized that actually the basis on which that we are outlining that legitimate interest is going to be difficult for you is probably correct. But of course, we still have a window of opportunity to have that conversation with you. Come forward if you are using legitimate interest and you think actually there is a solid basis for it. And we will have a good faith, honest conversation with you about that.
And that's a really interesting point because actually, as you've already touched upon, the ICO's been sort of pretty well known in the press over the last couple of months, around some of the hefty fines that they've issued BA and Marriott because they see that they're contravening the letter of the law. So there's it seems to me there's kind of your colleagues in enforcement and then there's you on the sort of information technology and policy side of the fence. How are you marrying the two, and what should people in the audience be sort of feeling about this? I mean, you've already sort of issued an invitation for people to come forward and discuss the way that they're approaching legitimate interest and the way that they're dealing with PECA and GDPR within their businesses. But quite literally, what's your move from here onwards? Because the report also goes into a bit of detail about what you're expecting the industry to sort of do and what you're expecting the industry to be able to demonstrate over a 6-month period. And, in prep for this conversation, when you and I were chatting, we were talking about how we're already 2 months into that 6-month period. So what do you sort of see as the direction of travel in terms of people conversing with you and what they might expect as a sort of a result of those conversations?
I'll preface it by saying that actually if you look at the growth in the ICO over the last couple of years, I mean, it's mushroomed massively. So from a couple of hundred up to, I think the last count is 700, maybe more. So as a regulator, data protection regulator, it's one of the largest in the world now. Don't quote me on whether it is exactly the largest or not, I'm not sure on the exact numbers, but there's been a massive growth. And that's happened in a number of different areas, both in how do we respond to businesses calling in for advice, citizens calling in for advice or trying to understand what they can do to respond, but also my enforcement colleagues making sure that they can tool up and be able to respond to the issues that we see, and then new directorates like technology innovation, which I work for, right? So our directorate in the ICO is brand new, less than a year old. But also alongside that, and just to get to your question, it's also worth you understanding how do we respond to things, and there's a short, medium, and slightly longer term perspective here. Very short term, if an issue is brought to our attention where there's been some egregious act or some issue, some breach, some data breach, personal data has been misused, it might have been done accidentally, it might have been done maliciously, an investigation will take place. And if you look at some of the active investigations which are resulting in fines, often that's been a response to an event, something has happened, there's been a leak of some data. And that will carry on, and most of my enforcement colleagues and others are really thinking about how do we respond to that. Then we start to enter into, I'll come to the long term first, which is how do we collectively with industry engineer an environment which allows you to do your jobs, deliver services which people benefit from. I mean, for example, to get here today, I benefited from tools and services to map my route here to this location, right? So the age that we're in delivers a huge amount of value. And I come from industry and business. We understand that that's good for the consumer, good for the citizen. So for the long term, we are really thinking about how do we help industry understand what are the tools that it can use. The event that we had around anonymization, privacy-enhancing technologies, the work we're doing on AI machine learning, that's all engineered towards that. In the middle is the sort of conversation we're having today, which is when we look across different sectors that are heavy data sectors, really relying on personal data, what's their health? Are they really paying respect to the consumer as an individual, as a member of society, as a citizen? Have they started to build in the rights that individual has into the way that they're engineering their business models and the way the ecosystem's working? And so how do you engage with us? Well, actually, the reason that we haven't gone straight to enforcement and said, we've had some complaints come in, let's just focus on those 1 or 2 or 3 organizations, is we actually want to work with this industry to say, help us help you transform. And the 6-month window is a window for engagement. And it's a window to show good faith and practical changes. It's a window to start on the journey that needs to be taken. I found it really interesting, some of the comments that Kieran and Andrew were making. I mean, granted, I only caught the sort of last five or so minutes of it, but even if a regulator didn't come along, you're facing sectoral challenges from what's happening in the browser space, what big platforms are doing, what the consumer feels about the way that their data is being utilized. As a precursor to our work, we did a survey with consumers, over 2,000 consumers, and when we first put the question to them, do you think it's okay to have targeted advertising to deliver online services for you? 63% I think said yes, really positive. When we started to then explain to them how that information for that one transaction or one page impression might then get shared in an ecosystem and what might happen with that, that dropped to half of that, 36 or whatever. My mental arithmetic isn't working right now. But it dropped down. So there's generally a move within the consumer space also for broader social reasons, which is demanding more transparency in the space. You have to respond to that.
For sure, and there's definitely a tension. We see it, we talk about it all the time. Obviously, we're talking about it a lot here today. We talk about it at Exchange Wire, you know, in our on-site content and in our sort of weekly podcasts. There's no two ways about the fact that there's a tension between sort of wanting to uphold and protect a vibrant internet and then also wanting to do that from a sort of user-first perspective. So it's really interesting to hear you use the language that you've used here and to sort of issue that invitation for the industry to have that open conversation with you. And I think that's fantastic. And I think, you know, as an industry, we need to play an active role in that. And perhaps there's something for Exchange Wire to do to try to help others be a conduit, perhaps, for a conversation with you. I'm sure you're working with other industry bodies and organisations as well, IAB Europe and others who would be critically important to that conversation. But I also imagine there's still probably a few people there in the audience that are thinking, okay, that's great. It sounds like you've sort of, you know, got the measure of some of the challenges that we're dealing with. But what is your perspective on what the big technology companies are up to? You know, and the moves and the decisions that they take along the way. For example, some of the decisions that the big tech companies who control our major browsers have made over the last couple of months. What's the ICO's perspective on that, and what's your position on that? And do you act on issues that relate to those sorts of big technology companies making decisions that have a far-reaching impact on the industry and the sort of competitive nature of the industry as well?
Sure. So what I can say is limited for two reasons that I'll explain in a second, but then I will try and talk around the subject and maybe get to the heart of what you're trying to ask. The two reasons that I'm limited in what I can say is, one, through Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, there's an appeal still underway. So in talking about Facebook, for example, is very limited, can't do that. That's an active investigation and that appeal's underway, so I can't really talk about Facebook in particular. But also when you're talking about Google and some of the other platform providers, our colleagues and counterparts in the CMA are doing a competition assessment around what's happening with big platform providers. I don't think it's appropriate for me to talk about that because you have to let that play out. And you know, we're working with them and have a good working relationship with them to try and understand how that issue might affect from a data protection angle what's going on, but need to let that play out.
Yeah.
I think more broadly, it is worth saying that, look, we are alive to the fact that data protection is one element, of course we believe a critical element, of the whole ecosystem. The degree to which publishers are under pressure, we're very live to that. The degree to which big players might dominate the ecosystem and have a certain degree of gravity, we're live to that. We're also take a keen interest in what's happening with the different browser providers, but also organizations and companies that might have different techniques to just cookies. And in many ways, actually, you know, we focus just on cookies. The law applies to cookies or similar technologies. It's not limited just to cookies. So any form of fingerprinting that you might be doing, any other technique that you might use to gather information, GDPR and PECA still applies. So we are looking at that recent announcements that have come out from some of the browser providers. Also, if you were to look at, you know, the likes of Apple and others, the degree to which they are starting to engineer towards responses, and I think, again, Andrew and Kieran touched on this, demands from consumers might push it that way, when you know really about how do you put some power back into the consumer's hands. Our role in that space is to make sure the right balance is struck between giving the consumer the right tools, meaningful tools to leverage their rights, but at the same time protecting the consumer from industries that might choose to offer tools that are burdensome to the consumer, add friction to the consumer. You know, it shouldn't be the consumer's issue to be able to navigate through the online experiences in a way that they constantly have to make online judgments about what's going on. And we recognize that is part of a bigger ecosystem issue as well.
Okay, Ali, we've drawn the short straw of butting up right against the coffee break, so I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up, but thank you very much, because that is, I think, the start of a sort of well-rounded conversation that we need to keep having as an industry, and hopefully not the first time we'll have someone from a government regulator joining us at ATS. Yeah. You're sticking around for the rest of the day, Ali?
I'm going to have to dash, but I know I'm keeping you from your coffees and teas, but I'll say this, the window of opportunity is, in good faith from us, open for engagement. Come and explain to us the sorts of challenges that you're facing, come together through bodies so that we can understand how you as an ecosystem, whether it's publishers, advertisers, or platform providers in the middle, are facing the challenges that you're facing and your plans to transform through that. But equally, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that at the end of that 6-month window, if we don't see meaningful change, then we'll have to consider, do we leverage our enforcement powers? We don't really want to go there. And in many ways, we've already seen some organizations enter into conversation with us in good faith who are saying, look, here's what we think we could do. Here's how we might go on a journey that takes us to a better place. That is something that actually we take very seriously and we pay a lot of attention to. And this is your window, really, to do that. In November, we are going to be having a second fact-finding forum. And I think that's the moment at the end of the 6-month period that really will be start to make some judgments about, okay, well, within this sector, within this ecosystem, within the supply chain, who is serious about addressing some of these issues and who isn't? I think the space to just watch and see and sit on the fence is disappearing. You know, if this was a beach where you're just chilling out and enjoying yourselves, the tide is coming in. And that's not just from a regulatory perspective, it's also about the social issues that people are facing. They are demanding more transparency in this space. But therein lies the opportunity as well. I think, you know, there will be first mover advantage. There will be advantage for being involved in shaping what the response needs to be. Sitting outside of that conversation doesn't help anyone.
Definitely. I think we all want to avoid fines and enforcement. So, yeah, there we go. Open invitation from Ali. Thank you very much, Ali. Coffee break, everyone.